I'll just wait for my presentation to come up, but in that time I want to start by thanking Christian and the others for winning the competition to host this conference and inviting me, as well as all of the organization and planning that went into it. It's been very smooth so far. I'm excited for the next 3 days. I want to start with just giving you the bullet points for this presentation, the 3 takeaway points that I want to make and illustrate over the next 15 minutes, and can we get into the details and discussion afterwards like we discussed. The first is that our understanding of risk needs to become more granular and tied to outcomes. And by this, I don't mean that aggregate measures just hide a lot of heterogeneity. That is very well true, and we'll see that. But that the way these collective risks impact individuals and households varies, sometimes in unexpected ways when we look at specific outcomes. So it needs more nuance. Another small point I want to make is that looking at coping strategies and how these individuals, households, communities deal with some chronic stress or level of stress can be a good way of understanding their underlying vulnerability as a proxy of their risk, as their overall vulnerability to situations of crisis. And these are now promising areas of research, looking at locally contextualized coping strategies as measurements of risk. And then finally, I will end with a city fragility and resilience framework that some colleagues and I developed that's based on some empirical evidence on the risk factors for cities deteriorating into a level of dysfunction akin to failed states and fragile states, and the factors or protective factors that were associated with resilience in those cities, which also opens up a new area of research on how those factors interact with one another to produce the outcomes of interest. So let's just jump into Nairobi. This is a project with Concern Worldwide, who's been collecting longitudinal geocoded household data in 3 informal settlements, Korigocho, Viwandani, and Mukuru. I work with them to look at how the sphere standards could be used as a lens to understand these environments. Now, for those of you that don't know, the sphere standards are a Bible of humanitarians almost. It is the basic minimum standards, mostly qualitative, that we apply to situations of crisis and affected populations. So how should you build a refugee camp? And it has it delineated by quantitative metrics on sectors such as water and sanitation, distance to a toilet, shelter, land area, nutrition, health, all of those kinds of features. Now, these standards, I've argued for a while, are not very well placed for urban environments, specifically the rapidly growing ones that we're addressing today. And so it's undergoing a revision to try to make it more adaptable to that. But we took the current version as a lens, and here's a sample of the things that we found. So where the sphere standards on the left prescribe 45 square meters per person in an area, these urban informal settlements in a setting of non-crisis had 12.5 meters squared per person. So our minimum standards as an international community for an acute disaster situation are far higher than what we find is the living standards in many of these informal settlements. Queuing time at a water source should be no more than 15 minutes. Almost a third had more of that. At least 95% of children should be vaccinated against measles, and measles is a very common disease outbreak that happens in crises. Anybody know why it's 95% and not 100%? So herd immunity, the idea that if you have 95% vaccinated with typical interaction, an infected person wouldn't get in contact with a non-infected person. We found it's 60% here. And you could argue with the densities that we're looking at from the previous speaker, that this should be even higher, maybe 99% for some of these, to prevent these outbreaks that are now becoming even scarier, Ebola being the most recent example. There are a whole host of others we collected on water quality and access, security, that I don't have time to go over, but it showed a stark difference. And it emphasizes the point that perhaps many of these communities could be said to be living in a state of chronic crisis if they're living far below what our international minimum standards are for acute crises and disasters. And if you look at some of these informal settlements from space the way the previous speaker did, a lot of their morphology looks the same. These 3 informal settlements don't look that different. And even in some of those aggregate measures, they don't look that different, or in income levels. But what we found in specific indicators of well-being, here it's hunger, that Korigocho, the red line, had spikes in indicators when the other 2 didn't. And we didn't completely understand this because we didn't develop a follow-on research project to look at that more qualitatively. And it shows the point that when we think about risk, and even if we get down to these informal settlements, even within cities, they're different from one another, and how they respond is different. And so looking at risk without looking at compensatory mechanism, coping strategies, adaptive capacities, gives an incomplete picture of finding outcomes and relating those risks to actual outcomes. Let's get a little deeper. This is Kotogocho, and these are income quintiles. So blue represents relatively higher income quintile, red represents lower income quintile, and then yellow in between. And if you try to map out, as a physician, the things I'm interested in outcomes are things like nutrition, health, mortality. So we looked at food insecurity, and this is a household food insecurity assessment scale, and household hunger score, which is a more severe form of looking at lack of access to food and nutrition. And it seems to correlate, if you look at the high income, relatively high income areas down here, those are doing well in blue here. If you look at the lower income quintiles, they also are showing more vulnerability. But if you look at Viwandani and Mukuru, there are other incongruencies that emerge. Some high income areas, if you look at this little elbow, showed high hunger scores in the vulnerability. And Mukuru similarly had some areas that were incongruent. And so this is the type of better, more nuanced granularity research that we need to show how these risk factors, even looking at urban poverty as a holistic risk factor in these areas, doesn't play out the way that we would always expect. And income is generally a good way. If you look at urban environments, they're dominated by market economies. Your income and purchasing power should dictate your access to a lot of goods and services. But there's other things at play. And so looking at these single measures versus composite measures is one way of thinking about this and thinking which individual measures relate to which outcomes, and therefore we can decide which ones to look at, and which composite measures are needed to look at other types of outcomes. But even then, looking at what those inputs should be. And I mentioned coping strategies as one way of trying to understand this. These were the various coping strategies used by the households in these 3 informal settlements to deal with shocks and stress. And the stresses I'm talking about, we looked at little things like flooding, fire, drought with food price spikes and how they responded. But you could imagine how this could be turned into a scale, and it's been done before in other situations. The research is limited, and this is why I'm saying that research needs to be done. We did a systematic review of targeting approaches in urban crises, and this systematic review just published last year showed that the data is incredibly poor. It's almost non-existent. And so there's a wide area of research necessary, and the small promising area that showed was looking at local coping strategies for various types of stress to be the way you could look at how vulnerable populations are and then target your programs and interventions. Let's move to Port-au-Prince. This is a project we did with Catholic Relief Services in 2 communities, Teso and Solino, with their disaster risk resilience project. Now this is, I'll just take you through Solino, and you can see, similar to the images we saw with the last speaker, the housing that you see within Solino, and you can see that some of it's even denser and a little more haphazard than even the surrounding informal settlements. Here's a hazard map with the blue shaded areas showing the high-risk flooding zones, the pink or orange shaded areas showing high-risk landslide zones, and then the yellow showing moderate landslide risk zones. Here again is the household structures and dwellings that fell below the sphere minimum standards. And if you look at which ones were damaged after the earthquake, it matches fairly well. So that indicator of falling below those minimum standards just for space area was also related to what your housing was probably made of, how tenuous it was, and prone to an earthquake. Now, I understand I'm in a room full of architects and planners and designers, and so I'm ready to be thoroughly impressed with the imagery and visuals that you will all show me over the next 3 days. Unfortunately, this is the prettiest thing I can draw, a table of data. But to me, this is sexy. And so this is a little busy. I'll take you through it, though. We have a forthcoming paper looking at these 2 communities and trying to identify which variables were most associated with resilience. We took a measure of resilience in these communities and then compared it against a whole host of variables. This is only a sample of them. Again, I couldn't show you all of them, but we looked at things like demographics, income, household size, how long they lived there, the permanence of their employment. And so on the left, you see some things come through individually, gender, income, education, but they're not consistent, and the magnitude of that effect wasn't that strong. On the right, overwhelmingly, the strongest and the greatest magnitude association was social cohesion. So if you looked at social cohesion, it had a greater effect on these communities in defining how resilient they would be or scoring high on the resilience scale compared to many of these other variables and ones that I don't show that you might think would be associated with resilience. This isn't perfect research. There's obviously a lot of variables that we weren't able to include into the model or collect data on, but it's an example of how to do this. Finally, let me introduce to you the city fragility and resilience framework that some colleagues and I developed. And we started with the premise that when some of these cities and vulnerable areas are stressed by a disaster or a shock of some sort, that they need to respond effectively and not deteriorate into level of dysfunction that would lead them to essentially become what we would call a failed city, a fragile city that is akin to a failed state. And we took the similar definition of fragility and failed from state literature. And so Robert Moga from the Igarapi Institute led the risk side of this and came up with these indicators that were empirically associated in the literature with being a fragile city and also were available through open data sets. And some of them are obvious, some not, but you can read more about this. Then took all of this from available open data sets and try to map that. And you can see the URL at the top and go and play with this data if you like. But they have it on the Igarapi Institute website, which is where all of the fragile cities are mapped using the data that's available, either of those indicators or proxies for them. I led the resilience side of the effort, similarly looking at what indicators were empirically associated with resilience, the ability to withstand and resist those threats and then maintain function. And you see some things come out: social cohesion, social protection programs, strong community government linkages, income and social. This should be equality, not inequality. I apologize for that mistake. But these are the ones that we could find in the literature. Now, this is a 1.0 version because both the science and the available data is behind where we need it to be. And so there needs to be a lot more science that shows empirical associations with resilience and fragility, because there could be many other indicators that just don't have that identified yet. And some of these may be weaker than we think because the studies are so few. The further area of research that's required is not only what the collection of these are. You know, that data visualization I showed you on the last slide is simply equalizing all of those factors, giving them the same weight and doing an additive model. We don't know that to be true, right? We don't know what weight each factor has, both in the risk side and the resilience side, to give that outcome, nor do we know how these interact, right? So a social protection program combined with good social networks might be the way to resist one type of risk and threat or hazard, but it may not be the way to resist another or a combination of some. And so there's a large area of research that's needed in this space on looking at how these various risk factors interact with one another to produce the outcomes that we're looking at. That's the only way we're going to use the very limited resources we have to design the appropriate programs and policies to now eventually reduce the impact of these threats, because we'll never get rid of all of that risk. That vulnerability exists, but if we could improve their resilience, that would be the way to go. But we'll need that type of research and data to guide that. Thank you.